In life, the one constant is change. Customer preferences, suppliers, technology, and staff expectations keep evolving, and we have to adapt to stay competitive. Over the last year, our members have seen leadership changes, mergers, and acquisitions, and major supply chain challenges. With all of these moving parts, what can we do to help our teams keep pace with all the changes? When workers feel psychologically safe at work, they are more resilient and can better adapt to change. And sometimes part of what makes us feel psychologically safe is knowing that we have the tools to manage the change effectively. How prepared are you to guide and prepare your team for change with confidence and care? In today's webinar, we've invited Dr. Steve Conway, Alliance Mental Health and Wellness Director, to share insights into the steps we can take to position ourselves and our teams for success. Steve brings more than 30 years of experience in mental health to his workshops, leadership consulting, and coaching, and is a terrific resource for the advice and education you may need in this area. Before I pass the floor to Steve, I also want to remind you that if you have questions, you can ask them in the Q&A box, and we'll discuss them with Steve after his presentation. Welcome, Steve.
Well, hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And let's see if I can make this transition work. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but Zoom has done some updates, and it's made doing this a little bit challenging. Let's see. All right. Hopefully you can see it. So thank you, everybody. I'm really grateful that you're lending me your attention this afternoon. So today, actually, yeah, we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about people leaders in particular, how they can lead their teams through change. Because change, we've all been through it. And if you've worked long enough, you've been through numerous changes. And these changes, they're difficult. So managing organizational change is a difficult task at the best of times. You know, initiatives are time consuming, they require resources, they require capacity, exceptional planning, but that's not enough. One of the things that usually gets left out is the role of the employee. Because at the end of the day, it is the employee who's actually going to be implementing these changes. And often, when employees don't feel like they're involved or they don't feel like they have a voice, we tend to see things like resistance, for example. And we're going to talk about all these ideas. I love this quote. You don't lead by hitting people over the head. That's assault, not leadership. And sometimes that's what people feel like when they're going through change. They're feeling like change is being something that's done to them and not done with them. They're not seen as part of the change process. And since we've all been through change, what exactly are we talking about? Because, you know, we have changes in our personal life, we have changes in every part of our life. It's a constant. But when we're talking about organizations in particular, when we say change, we're really meaning that process of transitioning from a current state of the organization to a desired future state. And this can be through new policies, practices, rules, or procedures. And these changes can be in different forms. They can be, you know, small changes, you know, like incremental changes where we talk about process improvement, product updates, policy adjustments, those kind of things. Or they can be rather monumental and transformational. And we're talking about any number of things like digital transformation, mergers and acquisitions, new leadership, rebranding, expansion. And all of these changes, whether they're small or whether they're large, can result in stress, not only for the individuals who are tasked with drafting the change and trying to make it occur, but for the employees in an organization who are actually confronted with, okay, so what does this change mean for me? And the stakes are really, really high when we're talking about change. Now, there's all sorts of numbers. That's the thing about, you know, the social sciences and business research. There's numbers galore. And there's a famous number that was put out years ago by McKinsey and Company. And they stated that of all change efforts, 70% of those fail. That, you know, Harvard School looked at that, you know, in 2015, and they questioned that 70% failure rate, thinking it's not that high. But in 2019, another study by Gartner, they said only about 50 to 70% of change initiatives succeeded. So even if most change does succeed, if we're not doing it well, it can derail our progress. And since change is time consuming, it's expensive, we don't have the opportunity often to skirt with failure. And so what is one of the biggest variables, in my experience in organizations, when change occurs, usually employees have some thoughts and opinions about that. And it's not uncommon at all for employees to resist, to push back, to appear difficult. But we want to transform that viewpoint. We want to kind of look at that and kind of repackage what that means. So I want to start with the premise that employees typically don't resist change just to be difficult. There's greater things at play for people. And so why do some individuals or why do some employees struggle with organizational change? There's a number of reasons. First of all, we have this fear of the unknown. Change is absolutely frightening because we don't know what to expect. Human beings, we like status quo, we like familiarity, we like comfort. And comfort comes from knowing that things are the way they are and I don't have to worry about it. So fear of the unknown is a frightening prospect for many people. When change happens, particularly when you're not the designer of the change or you have minimal information, we fear that we're going to lose control. And at the best of times, we don't have nearly as much control as we think we do. But even the prospect of losing a little bit of control can be quite unsettling for us. Sometimes we just like the way things are. I can look back at numerous organizations I've worked with over time, and in almost every single one of them, I can think of a time where I kind of thought that those were the golden years, and I wouldn't have wanted to change that for anything. But as life does, it does change. And it's been hard at times for me to let go of the things that the predictability, the way things were set up, because I got used to them. Change also makes people emotionally uncomfortable. It is stressful. We have all sorts of feelings that go along with it. Sometimes, when we have large organizational changes, we people move on, people change. We have grief attached to it. So there's all sorts of emotions that are brought up when we have fear, when we have change. Another thing is called, these hidden fears and competing commitments. And this idea of competing commitments comes out of the work of Keegan and Lacey. And so there's a great book on organizational change called Immunity to Change. And again, the premise of that idea is that people indeed are not resisting change to be difficult. They're resisting change because of fear, and also because they have these things called competing commitments, where I like things the way they are, but I'm also maybe a little bit excited about where things can go, and so we get kind of stuck. And then finally, one of the most obvious reasons why people struggle with change or where there's resistance is because sometimes there's just a fundamental lack in leadership. The people don't feel like the leadership is taking the time to talk with them, to ask their ideas, to have them be part of that process. And there's this great idea that I like, and it's the idea of authorship versus ownership. And when we're, most of the time as employees, the employees don't get much of a say, typically, but they do get the responsibility for making it work. And for a lot of folks, that doesn't really jive well for a lot of individuals, and that breeds a sense of resistance. So with this idea of authorship versus ownership, if you make the folks who are going to have to own the change, the employees, give them a sense that they're part of the design or the authors of that change, we have much greater levels of buy-in. And I love this quote: change hurts. And change does hurt. It makes people insecure, confused, angry, stressed out. And we want things to be the same as they've always been because it makes life easier. I don't have the bandwidth to deal with a lot of change. I've got commitments at home. I've got family. I've got kids. I've got all sorts of other things. And now I've got to deal with this change at work. So if you're a leader, you can't let your people hang on to the past because change is what we need to survive and be sustainable. but we have to work with change and with our employees in a way that reduces resistance and increases that level of important buy-in, because it's that buy-in that's going to make or break the change process. And we're going to refer to something called the Cotter's 8-step model. So I'm not making this stuff up. This is actually stuff that's already out there in the world. And this theory about the Cotter's 8-step model, it was developed in the 90s. And this model is really helpful in guiding organizations to develop effective and lasting change. Because when we're putting in the time and the resources and the effort of doing change, particularly if it's transformational change, we want it to stick. This model has been shown to be effective in overcoming employee resistance. And employee resistance, we want to start looking at that not as a sign that employees are being difficult, but that is actually a common stage in the change process. And we also want to make sure that we want to embed this change into the organizational culture. We want the change to be part of the DNA of the organization. And this model, it's widely used across industries for large-scale transformation. So there's decades behind it, and there's a lot of supporting research on this idea. And we're going to talk about this in turn. So we have the general 8 steps. So number 1, and we're going to talk about each one of these, create a sense of urgency, build a guiding coalition, form a vision, enlist a volunteer army, remove barriers, celebrate short-term wins, sustain momentum, and my image is in the way, see if I can get there, embed change. I'm not quite sure how I feel about having my face in the PowerPoint. It's kind of new. First of all, when we're engaging in a change process, we want to plan, but we want to create a sense of urgency. Employees, they're going to be curious, why do we have to do this? Why do we have to, isn't everything okay the way it is? Or even if they know that there's a problem, they're going to be worried about, oh, this is so much for me. So we need to create this idea that change is needed. And for example, using data on market trends, customer expectations, company performance, give the evidence that supports the rationale for the change to occur. But we want to be mindful of resistance at every single level of the Kotter model. So the first one is, we want to be mindful of resistance. And again, resistance is a normal part of the change process. It's not a sign of difficulty. The first one is we want to be asking questions in an open way with our employees. We want to be having meetings, and communication on a regular basis, and start to get a sense from folks, what worries you about this change? And we need to step back and listen to what they say, because it's those worries that will sow the seeds of resistance if we don't pay attention to them. And we want to understand, we want to empathize, and we want to make sure that we really understand what their concerns are. For many people, it can be, am I going to have a job? It can be, what does this mean for what I do for a living? Do I have the skills? Do I know how to do this? So we want to make sure we understand, while we're creating that urgency, what those potential roadblocks can be right from the get-go. It's important that we build a guiding coalition. So what does this mean? Really what this means is we're getting a group of internal cheerleaders. And these cheerleaders come from various parts of the organization, but they don't just come from the top. We need to have cheerleaders permeating every level of the organization. So we want to form cross-functional teams of those folks that we trust. They're influential. We're going to be really wanting to get the ones that are engaged with the process, engaged with the company, the ones that we feel can imbibe positive energy. And we want those folks to be the cheerleaders, to champion that change with their peers. It's one thing if it comes from senior leadership, but let's say that I'm working for a large company and I've never actually seen my senior leadership before, or they're somewhere in some other city or maybe in another country. Coming from them isn't going to mean as much to me as an employee if it comes from my manager, if it comes from a trusted peer that I work with. That makes a bigger impact on us. And again, we want to be mindful of the resistance. And so again, we want to be listening, always listening to what people are saying. And we want to use these cheerleaders as a way to, talk about employee concerns and the stakes. And we want to, again, identify what those competing commitments are. loyalty, to current processes. What is it about this? And some of the feedback I've gotten, from this model is that, oh, Steve, this takes an enormous amount of time. And yes, granted, this does take more time than disregarding any kind of input from your employees. But if you're going to be embarking on a process that's going to be costly, time consuming, and the stakes are really high if it fails, this to me is a sound investment in that process. People need to rally behind a purpose. We need to rally behind a vision that is compelling. And that, again, that is part of the leadership's responsibility. But we also want to listen to what other people have to say. And so, any kind of example, for example, leading in customer satisfaction through digital engagement. I don't know if that's jazzy enough, but for some folks it might be. But when we introduce this vision, again, we want to spend time listening to the folks, to the employees in the organization. What does that vision mean to them? How do they understand it? Does it make sense to them? Does it align with what they understand about the organization and the company and its goals? Does it align with their personal values? And yeah, when we have these meetings, when we have these conversations, we can expect that they're not always going to be very easy conversations. We can expect that we might hold on to some, oh, this is the greatest vision I've ever had. I can't believe I came up with it. I'm a genius. And we have to be prepared as leaders to hear people basically trash that idea. That's not an easy thing to do. But when we're defining a vision, we want to make sure that everybody's on board, everybody feels like they've had some input into it, and everybody feels like, yes, I can rally behind this idea. Because that, as human beings, I don't know, I think we're unique amongst all the creatures on the planet. I have cats. We don't get into deep conversations about meaning and values, but human beings do. And human beings, we will do almost anything for a vision and a purpose that we truly believe in. Just like those champions, we also want to have a volunteer army. And then these are those enthusiastic employees. These are the ones that lead by example. These are our natural leaders and role models, and they do not need to have a title. But we need to know who these are, and we know who these are when our people leaders take the time to pay attention. And so, for example, we could have these volunteers, these enthusiastic folks, pilot aspects of the change process to see how it goes. Because we know that these folks who are enthusiastic are going to be really, really focused and engaged on doing the best job they can. And so we will have a better sense of how it's going to roll out. And so, mindful of resistance again, we want to enlist those change supporters, identify them early on, get their buy-in. We want to recognize their efforts because it's a difficult thing. And sometimes these folks, they're going to go back and work with their peers on the floor perhaps, and they're going to have to convince and overcome the resistance of their peers who might be saying, oh, this is a ridiculous idea. So we need to support our volunteer army. And because they're part of a pilot, because they're part of early stages of initiating processes, they actually can describe the benefits of a new approach. It's one thing when it comes from people high up in the organization who aren't doing it. It's something completely different when we have somebody who actually has a hand-on experience with it. That is more credible in most people's eyes. Obviously, we want to make sure that we remove any barriers or obstacles that'll get in the way of that change. It's one thing to say, we are going to be doing this. But if we create, or we haven't thought through, or we haven't removed all of the things that are going to get in the way, all of the things that are going to sabotage the process, for example, outdated or insufficient technology, not enough resources. Do we need to train people on new approaches? If we haven't taken the time to identify what these are and remove them, that's a great source of employee stress and frustration. And as we're going through this process, we want to remove as many sources of frustration and stress as possible. We want to make sure that we're talking about those hidden fears and be very mindful about what's the tailored support that we maybe offer that individual or that team. Are we really paying attention? Because if these are the ones who are going to be implementing that change, they're going to have a greater sense of what they need. And so if they're saying, no, we need this this capacity. We need these resources. We need these tools. If we're not making it a priority to provide that, we're going to make it much more likely that this change process is not going to succeed. Who doesn't like a celebration? I like a good party. And when we're going through a change process, it is extremely difficult. It's hard for everybody in the organization. And so rather than wait till the end when everything has been, when the dust is settled and see how we're doing, and then, hey, let's celebrate. Every moment, every milestone, be them large and I think small is really good. Celebrate it. Acknowledge the work that's been done. Acknowledge the teamwork that's gone into making that success. Acknowledge specific individuals. Be very mindful about extending gratitude, because people, and there's a lot of levers available to leaders, and it's not just about a paycheck. There's research out there that supports that individuals would rather have well-intentioned, honest, authentic feedback about the job they've done from a supervisor than getting a raise. You might not believe it, but research tends to point that out. So recognize efforts, highlight the benefits. Again, we need to keep reiterating what the benefits of this are. It's like, you go to the dentist. When I'm in the dentist chair, I hate going to the dentist. When they're doing their thing and they're sticking needles in there and drills in there, in the moment, I know it's unpleasant, but I know what the benefits long-term are going to be. My teeth are going to stay in my head and they're not going to hurt. So just knowing that gives me the motivation and the perseverance to hang on. And we want to be very mindful about reinforcing everybody's role in the change. Sometimes what we do is we fixate on one or two individuals who typically shine. We want to be very mindful of focusing on as many people as we can, because sometimes the people who are doing the greatest work are the ones who do it without making much notice. They're not making any noise. They're just doing their work diligently. We want to make sure that we notice as many people as possible in this process. And we want to make sure that the momentum continues. Change is hard. It takes consistent effort. It takes ongoing energy and resources. And when people start to get fatigued, we can see that change processes start to stall. So to sustain that momentum, we want to reinforce progress all along the way. This is providing that continuous support. For example, training, resources. And training isn't just about, training on how to do it, work with a new machine or work with a new process. It's also training and education on how individuals can manage the change process themselves. And often we see some backsliding, and we need to tackle that. Because we have a tendency, when we're used to doing something a certain way over and over and over again, it's easy to go back to what we know. We go back to the familiar. We go back to the familiar almost by default. And so we need to have that consistent effort to make sure that we don't backslide back into familiar habits. And so we want to encourage the team, again, to be very mindful about, reflecting on the gains that they've made, what's been working well, what are the challenges been? What can we do to improve this process? And sometimes we just fall back in our comfort zones. With comfort zones, I love being comfortable. It's one of the greatest things. And so it makes sense that people would fall into that. We want to be vigilant about that. And sometimes, if we can nudge people in the right direction rather than throw them in the right direction, that tends to work better for individuals as well. And change, it needs to be part of the organizational DNA. We need to embed it deeply into the organization, because if we don't, it won't last. We also need to make sure that leaders at all levels are role modeling the change in the way that we want to see it. So this has to do with, do we have the right policies in place? Are we measuring the appropriate things that we should be measuring? What are our metrics? What are the incentives that we're using to see this process through to the end? And so, but as we go through this, there will be resistance. And so we want to make sure that change is part of our daily routines. We want to make sure that, again, it's embedded into the DNA, that we don't give individuals an opportunity to backslide into old routines. So we still need to encourage that ongoing feedback. How is this going? What's working? What's not working? And we need to pay attention to that. It can feel like a nuisance when we're trying to get this thing going. But sometimes if we really listen, some of that feedback, which might be perceived as negative, might actually have valuable information that if we don't heed, can derail our change process. And the entire time, we want to be continually addressing employee concerns because it's going to be going on. For the duration of the change process, people are going to have concerns about it. And change succeeds when employees are not only affected by the change, but are empowered to help shape it. And I've had, and I've heard people say, well, my employees, they're not qualified. They don't understand how to do this change, how to do these change processes. Well, that might be true to a degree, but the employees know what the change will mean to them in their day-to-day work. And if the employees are the ones who are going to be expected to do the work, the more we get them on board, the more we provide a sense of authorship, not just ownership, as I said earlier, that is when people feel empowered, and that is when people feel engaged to help with this change process and to help it become much more successful. But we talked earlier on in the introduction that we want to make sure that there's an air of psychological safety. And so reducing resistance through openness. Years ago when I was more of a therapist, there's a type of therapy called motivational interviewing. And that's the kind of therapy that you do a lot with mandated clients. I worked in a prison for a while, and I worked in correctional settings, and I had a lot of mandated folks. And a key idea is when resistance happens, which it does, rather than force our agenda through, we roll with resistance, right? It's kind of a form of a keto in a way. We need to roll with resistance in organizational change as well, rather than confront it and fight it like a hammer or a bull in a china shop. We need to operate from a psychologically safe perspective. We need to operate in a way where employees feel safe to voice what their thoughts are, their concerns are, their contributions, without fear of getting in trouble, without fear of retribution, without hearing things like, this has got nothing to do with you, just get back to work. If we wanted your opinion, we would ask. We want to be open to hearing it. And this isn't easy to do because sometimes we hear things that we think, this makes no sense to me, I don't disagree with it, or we can't do it. And I don't want to be accused of being Pollyanna-ish about this. There are certain things that, organizations need to do. And employees don't get to dictate what the changes are. That's just reality, but so there's having a voice and having a say. When we provide the opportunity to have a voice, the need for the say goes down. So we need to create that environment where employees feel like, hey, I have this concern, or I've noticed that this change process, I've noticed this, but I've been doing this job for 30 years, and I think that might not work. As a people leader who wants this change process to work, it would be in my best interest to say, really, can you tell me more? Tell me what your thoughts are. It might be something that doesn't work. It might be something that we can't implement, but there might be something in there that would really be helpful. At the very least, because we took the time to listen, we're going to get more of that individual's buy-in in the future. So if we want to practice, if we want to be psychologically safe as people leaders and ensuring that the change process works effectively, we have to practice emotionally intelligent leadership. We have to understand the emotional aspect of the change situation. We need to identify what's happening with other people. We need to identify what's happening with ourselves. It's frustrating to have resistance. It can be demoralizing when we're trying to get something through and it's not going according to plan because people aren't cooperating. We need to understand what we're feeling and how, and manage it. But we also need to understand how our employees are feeling and manage that and use these levers successfully to promote that change process. We want to be encouraging and, of questions and concerns. We want to be approachable. We don't want to make a situation where people feel like I can't say anything to my boss because he's not interested or she's going to yell at me. It's very important that we understand that change for many, many people is not an easy thing. It's not an easy ask. And so we want people to be vulnerable because if they're not, we don't normalize that, it'll come out in other ways, right? We want to be head on with this. And those competing concerns, for example, people wanting stability, people wanting things to be the way they are. Yeah, it can be frustrating because we want to get on with it. We don't have all the time and resources in the world. But if we want to get the employees on board, we need to give that time and listen, right? And listen to why these concerns exist, why this resistance is there, what these competing commitments are. We want to just open our ears and pay attention. But as you know, as we've all been there, and every one of us, I would assume, has been through some kind of organizational change in their life. The organization is not the only thing changing. The individual, we're changing along with it. And I remember a number of changes. I remember one change in particular where I had this colleague, and this individual, he had a lot of competing commitments and he had a lot of resistance. And at the time, I wasn't as understanding about what those were. And this individual dug in his heels, dug them in deep, and wouldn't budge while everybody else was moving on. And I just saw how stressful it was for this person. And it actually caused this person to have really negative health outcomes because just that inability to accept what was happening. And yeah, we can lay it all on this individual's, feet. But I think the organization that I was involved in at the time didn't do a really good job of addressing this individual's concerns. So we want to be mindful, when we have individuals, when we have people that report to us, when we're people leaders, we want to understand, we want to support people as a group, but also as an individual, because when we do that, we build trust. We build trust. They think employees see you as being more authentic and more empathic. That reduces people's resistance because they see each other, we're seeing each other as human beings. We want to address unique concerns and needs because not everybody's going to have the same concern. What somebody maybe who is new to the company, maybe just started, maybe we're making some technological changes, that person might roll with it rather easily. But if you have an older worker who has been doing the same job in the same way for quite a long time, they might have a very, very different fear about what's going on. So we want to listen to that as an individual. Because when we do that, it increases their engagement and buy-in. Rather than becoming, those distant folks who are foisting this change on us, we become part of a collaborative effort. When we support individuals during the change, it also enhances their adaptability and confidence. They feel seen, they feel heard, and sometimes we can coach them along. And in organizations, organizational change is a time where a lot of upheaval happens. We want to make sure that we're keeping the best people that we have while also keeping the morale high. Because while we're going through this change, there's still customers to deal with, there's still products to get out on time. So we need the best product, and that requires engagement of our employees because we want the change to be sustainable. We want it to work. And there's another model. So I'm throwing all these models at you. There's something called the ADKAR model. And this is a model that's really it's really about supporting individuals. And it can be very helpful for people leaders to kind of understand what this is. And it was developed in the early 2000s by Jeff Hyatt. And it's really about focusing practical and pragmatic ways to support individuals through transformation or through transition. And it emphasizes awareness, desire, and reinforcement. And so in the model, we have awareness of the need. So we want to support individuals with these elements. We want to support them in creating more awareness about the need for change. We want to inspire them and give them greater desire to support that change. Not everybody knows how to change. They don't know what to do. So we want to provide the knowledge on how to do that. How do I make this change? I've been doing the same job for 20 years. I don't really know what I'm supposed to do. We want to not just give the knowledge, but we want to help them with their ability. So this is about developing new skills, new behaviors, that again, allow the tools to do the job. And always remember we talked about complacency or backsliding. We want to reinforce the change and keep it front and center in a way that does not turn people against it. It does not instill more resistance. So as a leader, as a people leader, talking to an individual, The first step is awareness. Explain why change matters to each person. Yes, this can be a very time-consuming process, and you might only be able to do this with a few people. But when you're noticing individuals, particularly who are struggling, this can go a long way. So explain, why do we need to do this? Because we don't do well in a vacuum. When we have a vacuum and we don't have enough information, we create reasons why. And a lot of the times, these reasons aren't accurate, they're not factual, they're not helpful, and we have gossip flowing around. So if we can provide this message, why, that reduces that information vacuum. We want to focus on that desire part. So, how I want to talk. So tell me what your concerns are. And I know can be painful in the beginning, but this is what we intend to see as a result of this change process. Do you have any questions about that? Is there anything else you need to know? Acknowledging that the change will likely require new ways of doing things, new skills, new processes. We want to make sure that we're training everybody so that they have the skills and abilities to do this. We don't want to leave anybody behind. The same, with that reinforcement with the individual, when we see them doing something well, let's look out for successes. Let's pay attention, not just to the resistant, but any moment where we see, this person's showing that they're getting it, or this person's showing momentum in the right direction. Let them know. Let them know you saw it. Look for people doing things right. And I got to get out of the way. Ability to offer coaching and practice. There we go. Because sometimes people just need coaching. They need to have an idea about what their capacities are. And coaching isn't telling people what to do. What coaching is about is helping people, utilize their own knowledge, their own skills to move them forward. And it's a very effective approach for people. So the reality is that the only way we change is when you lead by example. And I think this is also really critical because as we're going through this change process, we have to role model the behaviors we want to see. We have to role model it on an ongoing basis. And again, this can be an exhausting piece of the process. But change is inevitable, but it doesn't have to be inevitably successful. And what we want to do is make sure that when we start a change process, that it's going to work. And making sure that we harness the talents and the voices of our employees, we're going to have much more success. So 40 minutes. I was given 45. Look at this. If we have any questions, I will do my best to answer them in a coherent way.
Thanks, Steve. Wow, you've given us a lot of takeaways here. And I think one of the things that resonated with me was authorship or authorship over ownership, because often I've been in, organizations where, well, it's your baby, it's your department, you own it, you go do it. And it's like, yeah, but you just handed me a bag of airplane parts
Yeah.
and I own it, but I never had any say in how all these parts came together,
Yeah.
and what would make it work. So, I think in the past that definitely has been something where people go, well, you own it. And then they think they're doing you a
Yeah.
favor
Kind of
because
like,
you can decide,
yeah.
but you need it to be more on the ground level. So, yeah, that's great. And I think too, like a number of when you said resistance to change, I think everyone on this call, especially from health and safety managers, joint health safety committee members, anyone who has dealt with health and safety, and you have to change a process in a manufacturing setting, you'll often hear that person say, well, I've been doing it this way for 30 years and it's never been a problem. Like, I don't understand why we need to fix what isn't broken.
Yeah.
So, again, there's always that naysayer that is very dominant. So,
Mhm.
how would you know, deal with someone like that where you can see that the momentum is going well, the team is going well, but this person is very influential and has been with the company a long time, and you don't want to just ignore their concerns. How would you handle that?
Yeah, and I would actually say ignoring their concerns can actually be quite a very dangerous thing to do, particularly
Mhm.
if they're influential. And I don't want to, again, I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that any of what I'm talking about is an easy thing to do. I'm not saying that anything I'm suggesting doesn't take a lot of time. And sometimes more time than you feel like you have.
Mhm.
But if we have an individual who's been there and is saying, look, I've always done it this way and it's not been a big deal, and they're influential, well, if I've paid attention to anything I've ever learned, it would be, getting past my own, because I'm going to have resistance as a people leader. I'm going to want to resist that narrative that they're giving me and, get frustrated potentially. I want to take the time to think, okay, back up my bus here. What might be going on for this person? Why are they
Mhm.
struggling with this? It might be something where I just have a conversation with them, to get very clear. And I will do my best to work with that person to provide the knowledge, to provide the information, to provide the resources. So, I think I'm being, I'm Steve, the nice mental health and wellness guy. But there does come a time where we need to be mindful of the folks that are on board. We need to give them time to get on board. But eventually, we need to be mindful that, there will be some folks who, if we're not careful with, they can create a souring of the organization, and we want
Yes.
to act on that, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
we also want to manage. This is not a time where we don't manage performance.
Mhm.
So as we're going through change, we want to be supportive, but there are certain behaviors that are just not helpful, and we want to manage that effectively.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. So what about, again, sometimes change comes, as you say, from the top, and people throughout the organization aren't necessarily involved in the decisions that are made. And what happens if the change is confidential and can't be shared with the teams? How would you know, coach managers to, you know, s- I guess spread out that change message without really telling them the why for it?
Yeah, that's a really difficult one because the why might be confidential, but people
Mhm.
are going to be seeing that things are happening,
Yes.
right? And they're going to be wondering, why are we having to do this? And without a consistent message that offers some degree of information, it's not about, when I'm saying communicate, I'm not saying open up all the state secrets, right? If
Mhm.
there's a change happening, there will be a rationale. You don't have to go into the nitty-gritty fine detail, but I think it's incumbent upon any people leader to provide a cogent rationale for why this is happening. Because if you want people to get on board, people are less likely to get on board if they have no idea why that's happening. So again, it doesn't have to be, don't have to open up state secrets here. But I
Right.
think that's where people leaders, they need to have a pretty clear communication strategy for what this is. And they need to be consistent on that.
Mhm.
I'm a big believer that, you can't communicate enough.
Mhm.
When you thought, so communicate, 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 and when you thought you've communicated enough, then communicate some more.
Right. Right. What's that saying? You have to tell someone something 50 times and reiterate it 50 times
If you
before
were
it
asking
finally
my wife,
sticks.
she would say I'd have to be told way more than that.
All right. Okay. So, just looking at some more of the questions that are just starting to come in here. Um, when you talk about reasons why change is happening, you shared that people can make up reasons. So we've already talked about that. This one here came in as far as like the confidentiality, so that's good. Um, oh, here's one. How do we find a volunteer to champion change? If you how do you get the group to be enthusiastic about it?
Well, when we're kind of looking for that champion, I think
Mhm.
the secret to that is, well, first of all, as a people leader, are you paying attention to your team? Do you know
Mhm.
who's on your team? Are you engaging in, are you regularly taking the time just to notice?
Yeah.
On most teams, at least most teams that I've ever worked on, you have that individual is a top performer. They're motivated, they're engaged. They're always not always the majority either. We want to
Mhm.
get that person, the person who's respected by their peers. And those folks exist in almost every organization. So we want to take the time to notice who they are. We want to talk to them. We want to enlist them. And if they're engaged employees, they're going to want the organization to succeed. And I
Yeah.
think most people, if your people leader comes up to you and says, you know what, we really value what you do around here, and we need your help.
Mhm.
This is what we'd like you to help. What do you think of that? Right? Don't just say you're doing this.
Right.
That's how we get those change champions. And again,
Mhm.
but we have to communicate with them, and we have to give them the resources they need to be successful as well.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I mean, you tell me about any team you've ever worked on where you haven't had somebody who other people look up to, who's a positive.
For
Every
sure.
organization has them.
Yeah, 100%.
In ours, it's you, Therese.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Steve. All right, so, here I know I have to be careful in time, but one of them is, um and, obviously, again, you said talk to your people, communicate, ask questions, that kind of thing. But are there other options? How does leadership incorporate employee feedback into the wellness programs or workplace changes? So, other than just the communication, as far as saying, okay, do you guys have any ideas? Because sometimes people don't really want to come forward or put their hand up.
Mhm.
So, is there other scenarios,
Well,
options
yeah, I
you
mean,
could,
you can do
provide?
anonymous engagement surveys. You can do
Hmm.
anonymous, questionnaires. Now, the caveat I would say to that is who hasn't worked at organizations where you get these questionnaires, you answer them, you spend the time answering, and nothing happens.
Nothing
They
happens.
fall into they
Yeah,
go over the event horizon into the black hole, never to be seen again.
yeah.
If the intention is to do that, to be performative about it, that's gonna backfire. So if you're
Mhm,
gonna do an engagement survey, you need to release results. You need to let people know what the scores are, the good, the bad, and the ugly. You need to say, and sometimes we like to gloss over the bad and the ugly. We need to
mhm.
address those concerns in a meaningful way. It doesn't mean that we can do everything, right? So again, I'm not saying give the reins of control to the employees. I'm saying they're collaborators, they're partners in making an organization successful. And if we don't
Yeah,
spend time listening to them, are we going to breed engagement or resentment? And
mhm.
my argument is that an engaged employee is far more productive and valuable than a resentful one. So
Yeah,
surveys are very
goes
great
without saying.
if you act on them.
Yeah, right. So, one last, I guess, question or, through your presentation, one key thing that, of course, makes organizational change easier on employees is when we have a healthy and psychologically safe workplace to begin with. So, for the leaders that are out there, are there suggestions or courses that you offer that can help teams become more engaged?
Well, of course there are. And we offer a number of them. So I
Do
would say,
we?
yeah, I'd say, there's courses on obviously on emotional intelligence, really helpful for people leaders. On developing those relational or so-called soft skills. And some people, they go, "Oh, we don't use that term soft skills because it's off-putting." I don't care what term you like to use. What we're talking about is the fact that leaders, whether they like it or not, are in relationship with the people that report to them. And the more we engage in effective relational skills, it brings people along. And so that's really important. I would say, a healthy company culture is going to go a long way towards having people. If I'm in a culture where, there's bullying, there's negativity, and nothing's ever done about it, and a change happens, I'm more likely to go, "Oh, what do I care?" Right? But if I'm in an organization where I get a real sense that, they care about how I feel, they care about my colleagues, this is a good place to be, that
Mhm.
motivates people. So
Yeah.
leadership training around those essential soft skills or relational skills, culture training. I think it's also really important that when change happens, it creates a lot of stress for people. And so
Mhm.
and if people are having, mental health issues or pre-existing mental health issues, it can exacerbate them or being under enough stress for long enough. And most change processes they don't happen overnight. They're rather
No.
long drawn out, particularly if they're going to work, right?
Mhm.
That's a stressful thing. So how are we supporting our employees through that? Are we giving them the supports? Are we giving them any training around it? Are we training our managers and people leaders to identify when somebody's struggling from a mental health perspective? All those things go a long way.
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, so getting back to, okay, so your courses. So, what we'll do for after when we send out the recording, maybe we'll do a little recap of some of the courses that you mentioned so that people can have them and can look at on our website. The one other thing that it kind of stuck with me as you were sharing just now is, when you have that naysayer, like we were talking about earlier, and performance management is key during change to manage that person, that the naysayer. Because the one thing I've experienced as a leader is, you know, sometimes you want to just avoid that person altogether and
Yeah,
not deal with it. But
yeah,
then it starts the
yeah,
toxicity, right? Because then you're the other people in the team are going, why isn't this person being dealt with?
yeah,
You're just ignoring it. But then where's my value when you're just allowing that person to continue that and,
yeah.
impact my daily work life?
Avoidance is never, I mean, let's put it this way, avoidance is not a good strategy. I can understand why
Mhm.
leaders might want to. They're busy,
Mhm.
or they're not confident, or
Mhm.
they've never had the skills or the development around how to do that. Because let's face
Mhm.
it, most of us haven't been taught that. We learn
Yeah.
it, or we learn the negative ways by watching people do it. And so it's hard to do. And
Mhm.
avoidance is kind of what people like to do. The thing is, it's like a cavity, right? Have you ever had a small cavity and thought, I can avoid it, no big deal.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
eventually it just leads to bad things. So the sooner we address it, the sooner again it promotes that organizational culture, because people say, look, they're actually dealing with this. Because negativity,
Yeah.
there's one thing to have if we're thinking about a psychologically safe workplace, it's okay for people to have dissenting opinions.
Mhm.
That's okay. We can have them. But it's something completely different when that individual is deliberately poisoning the well,
Yes.
is sabotaging the team or the organization, is not getting
Mhm.
on board. That's a completely different story, and that needs to be managed.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes, for sure. Okay, so we're kind of at the end of our time here. So, did you have anything, final remarks that you wanted to add, or what are, if they learned anything today, what's the one thing you want them to take away today?
If anybody has learned anything today, that when we make a change and we see resistance, don't assume it's that employee just trying to make life hard for us. It
Mhm.
might feel like it's making life hard, but then we want to think, well, maybe life's hard for them, and we can engage in a dialogue to understand it, because that's
Mhm.
going to be where this change is going to take root.
Right. Very good. I like that. Don't avoid.
Don't avoid.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much, Steve, for your time today.
My
And for those that are on this webinar, any other questions left unanswered today, we'll review with Steve and share his answers along with the recording on our website. And as I said earlier, Steve has shared a lot of information, and I want to reiterate that he's also here to advise, coach, train, and just reach out and connect with Steve if you feel that your organization could benefit from, some of his courses or one-on-one interaction. And if you've enjoyed today's webinar, come back and join us next week for the last one of 2024, a virtual panel on developing and maintaining safety culture through core certification to the Occupational Safety Standard of Excellence. Our CEO, Wayne Arondis, will be joined by safety folks from West Coast Reduction and Redux Nutrition, and our own OHS audit manager, Hassan Nadande. Say that 3 times fast.
No, thank you.
Yeah. And listen in for tips on what you can do to gain and maintain certification, defeat complacency, and make your health and safety program stronger and more vital. So please register today if you would think that would be beneficial. And as always, visit us online for help or to access our webinars and resources. Watch for an email tomorrow with the link to the recording of today's session. And as you leave, please take a couple of minutes, if you wouldn't mind, share your thoughts in this very quick survey that's being sent out. And again, thank you everyone so much for joining.
Thank you,
Take
everybody.
care. All right. Bye-bye.